A thick, gray mist crept along the cobblestones like a living thing, slipping into every crack and crevice, wrapping the village in a suffocating embrace. It rolled around shuttered windows and splintered doors, carrying the faint, acrid tang of decay that clung to the stones and soaked into the damp wood of abandoned homes. Smoke rose from lonely hearths, fragile and thin, twisting upward only to vanish into the fog, as if even fire itself feared the silence of this place. The air was heavy with cold, wet despair, and every breath tasted of ash and something older, something bitterly human. Time had slowed here, or perhaps it had stopped entirely, leaving only the rhythm of heartbeats and coughs to mark its passage. The church bell tolled, each clang hollow and distant, swallowed by the mist before it could reach the edges of the village. It was not a call to worship, nor a summons to celebration. Each stroke measured absence, a metronome for fear, counting the lives already claimed. Behind cracked doors, villagers huddled, faces pale beneath soot-streaked hoods, their eyes wide and haunted. Every cough was a message, every shiver a warning. Mothers clutched children to their chests, as though sheer desperation might keep the invisible predator at bay. Fathers sat silently in corners, hands trembling over the wooden arms of chairs, staring into the dim glow of candles that sputtered against the thick darkness. The plague had rendered the familiar strange, the comforting dangerous, and the ordinary unbearable. In a market square, once alive with laughter and bargaining, silence reigned. Barrels lay overturned, the rancid remains of what once fed the village now a banquet for rats whose beady eyes shone with a dim, trapped winter light. The animals scuttled through spilled grain, over rotting vegetables and discarded scraps, leaving behind trails that glistened like threads of silver in the fog. Even the children, small hands clasped in their mothers' palms, shivered at the sight of these scavengers. They did not yet understand what had taken their fathers, their siblings, their friends, but they could feel it, an invisible weight pressing down, heavy and unyielding, from which there was no refuge. Among the shadows moved a single figure, deliberate and solemn. The priest, clutching a silver cross blackened with age, wove through the mist, scattering drops of holy water that hissed faintly as they hit the cold cobbles. His prayers, muttered in Latin, trembled in the frigid air, each word a fragile plea against the pervasive darkness. His breath rose in thin clouds, curling around his face, and he looked at each shuttered window with a mixture of sorrow and determination. The cross in his hand caught what little light there was, flashing briefly like a shard of hope against the gray. He paused beneath a withered apple tree, gnarled and skeletal, its few remaining fruit blackened and split, crawling with ants. He bent and touched one with the tip of his boot, as though acknowledging the futility of life in the face of relentless decay. "May your souls find rest," he whispered. Around him, the mist moved like a tide, and the rats paused mid-scurry, as if even they respected the gravity of this place. Inside the houses, the living clung to fragile rituals. Mothers hummed lullabies that sounded more like prayers, pressing children to their chests and whispering against trembling lips. Fathers murmured fragmented verses from psalms, words rattling off tongues that no longer believed in salvation but feared its absence. One small girl pressed her ear against the floorboards, listening for the cough of her neighbor, a sound that had become a death knell in the past weeks. Each tick of the clock was punctuated not by comfort, but by dread, a cruel reminder that survival was fleeting and fragile. The priest's steps took him deeper into the village. A dog, thin and shivering, emerged from a shadowed doorway, its ribs visible beneath matted fur. It barked once, hoarse and ragged, then fled into the mist, leaving only silence in its wake. Smoke curled from another hearth, thicker here, carrying the scent of burned herbs and something foul. Inside, a man sat hunched over a table, scratching feverishly in a journal. His hand shook so violently that the letters blurred. Yet he wrote on, a desperate act of defiance, of proof that he had existed, that someone had witnessed the slow unraveling of life. The church bell tolled again. The sound was different this time, slower, heavier, each strike lingering in the mist like a tolling drum of the dead. The priest lifted his head, eyes searching for signs, for meaning, for mercy. He found none, and yet he moved onward, stepping over the scattered refuse of life, the fallen apples, the broken barrels, the silent witnesses to suffering. In one home, a child whimpered softly, a sound that ricocheted against the bare walls. Her mother's fingers dug into her hair, pressing her head to her chest. The girl's eyes, wide and uncomprehending, tracked the shadows in the room, shadows that might belong to the plague, to spirits, or simply to the mind's imagination stretched thin by fear. Across the hall, an old man coughed violently, clutching at his chest as if trying to hold his heart inside. He had been the village blacksmith, strong and steady, and now he was nothing but fragile flesh and trembling breath. Outside, the fog thickened, wrapping the village in a cocoon of gray. The priest's voice rose, carrying Latin prayers that seemed to hang in the air, visible as trembling waves of cold mist. He passed the withered apple tree again, noting the blackened fruit and the ants crawling over it, each one a tiny testament to life persisting in decay. He knelt briefly, dipping his hands into the cold earth, feeling the pulse of the land beneath his fingertips, a pulse that was both life and death intertwined. Rats scuttled along the cobblestones, their tiny claws clicking, their eyes glinting. The priest did not flinch, though he felt their presence as one might feel a shadow brushing against the soul. He moved past them, into the deeper part of the village where the fog swallowed entire houses, leaving only outlines and echoes. A faint wind lifted, carrying with it the smell of wet earth, of smoke, of something metallic, blood, perhaps, or rust. It was impossible to tell. The fog had erased distinction, leaving only the sensation of threat, the certainty that danger lingered unseen. The villagers, pressed against walls and behind doors, shared in this collective terror. One woman traced the shape of her child's face with a trembling finger, whispering encouragement that no one could hear, not even the dead who walked beside them in memory. Across the square, a man placed a candle in the window, its thin flame trembling as if unsure of the world it had been born into. The fog seemed to lean closer, as if to test the courage of such a small light, and for a moment it wavered. Above it all, the raven waited, black wings glinting with frost. It watched from the steeple, observing the silent terror, the whispered prayers, the futile acts of survival. And when it lifted, it cast a long shadow over the village, a reminder that life and death existed in fragile tension, that even as flesh decayed, memory and fear endured, threading through the fog like smoke. The priest moved on again, leaving behind the square, leaving behind the rats, the fallen apples, the empty hearths. His cross, now dulled further by the cold, caught the last rays of the winter sun, fragmenting them into scattered light across the gray. He paused at the edge of the village, looking back once, seeing not houses or streets, but a tapestry of human endurance stitched through despair. Somewhere in the distance, a candle flickered behind a shuttered window, faint but defiant. Somewhere a child's sob was swallowed by the mist, unheard but unforgotten. Somewhere, hope lingered, fragile as frost on a tombstone, waiting for the moment when it might bloom again. And still the fog crept, still the rats scuttled, still the plague waited, patient and inexorable. The village held its breath, suspended between what had been and what was yet to come, and the priest whispered one final prayer as he disappeared into the gray. Domini, protege numbers. Lord, protect us. The words hung in the air, drifting on the wind, carried into the shadowed corners where memory and fear entwined. The ravens circled one last time before vanishing into the endless gray sky, wings slicing through the frozen air. Its departure left a silence heavier than the fog, a silence that spoke not of absence, but of vigilance, of waiting, of lives intertwined with the inevitable. And in that silence, the village remained, trembling, shivering, but still alive, poised on the edge of despair and hope, waiting for the sun to pierce the gray, or for the next toll of the church bell to mark another life claimed. Through the heavy wooden doors of the manor, a groan rises, low and tremulous, scraping against the rafters like a blade drawn through cloth. It is not a single voice, but many, overlapping in sorrow and pain, each a fragile echo of life, clinging to bodies hollowed by fever and hunger. The air is thick, almost viscous with the metallic tang of blood, the sharp, acrid scent of burned herbs, and the pungent bitterness of vinegar and oils pressed into desperate remedies. Linen wraps are soaked and stiff with sweat, pressed against faces pale as ash, eyes wide and unseeing, pupils swimming behind veils of torment. The hearth crackles weakly, an orange tongue flickering and bending against the chill, as if it too fears bearing witness to the suffering within these walls. Outside, the fields lie fallow beneath a sky the color of old iron, heavy with clouds that promise rain, yet give nothing. Earth, plowed and turned, rests like a patient corpse, stripped of fertility, barren of the green shoots that once sustained life. The land mourns with its people. Even the wind seems cautious, careful not to stir the soil too violently, as if aware that every movement could unravel what little remains. A widow kneels beside a straw-strewn mattress, her body pressed against her only son. Her shawl is damp, ragged, smelling faintly of smoke and sweat. Her fingers trace the fevered contours of his face, trembling as though the simple act of touch could rewrite the cruel rules of this fragile body. She whispers prayers to saints she cannot name, words carried thin as smoke to corners where shadows gather like silent predators. A blacksmith, once the heartbeat of the village, stands near the soot-darkened window, hands curled into fists that ache from unused strength. Days have passed since his hammer sang against iron. Silence has replaced the symphony of his forge. He watches smoke curl from distant chimneys, thin spirals dissolving into the gray sky. Some rise from homes abandoned, empty shells where laughter and life have been swallowed by the plague. Others mark stubborn pockets of survival, families refusing to surrender, though their courage trembles under the weight of loss. His chest tightens with a guilt that tastes bitter, for strength and skill offer little here, and the forge, once a symbol of creation, sits cold, impotent in a world undone. The rope swings from the bell tower outside, slow and deliberate, a pendulum marking hours that seem meaningless. Its swish scratches the stillness, reminding all who hear it of the fragile thread upon which life hangs. Villagers dare not speak, for even the sound of a whisper feels dangerous, heavy with the weight of mortality. Candles gutter and hiss as darkness seeps into every corner, smoke curling upward like spirits released from bodies already claimed. Each flicker casts shadows over the faces of the living and the empty cots of the dead alike, blurring the line between presence and absence. The widow rocks her son, shivering beneath her touch, fever painting his cheeks crimson. She wipes his brow with the edge of a rag, tasting the salt of her own tears. Outside, the wind carries the scent of damp hay, mold, and the bitter sting of rosemary burned to ward off death. She hums a melody she barely remembers, a tune for before the sickness, when life had a rhythm and fear had a shape she could contain. Each shallow breath her son takes is a small miracle, each sigh a soft rebellion against the inevitable. She closes her eyes, imagining green fields, laughing children, a sun that warms without warning, though the vision dissolves instantly under the oppressive gray of the manor walls. Within the hall, the hearth struggles to keep the chill at bay. Shadows curl into corners, forming shapes that might be human, might be spirits, might the fractured imagination of minds fraying under fear. The blacksmith shifts, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense quiet. His gaze sweeps the room, taking in the faces of neighbors, kin, strangers, each carrying stories of endurance and grief. The weight of helplessness presses against his chest, the knowledge that skill, that fire, cannot change the course of this night. Outside, the rope in the bell tower creaks again, swinging against its own shadow. Bells, once heralds of weddings and markets, toll now only in memory. The hollow sound resonates, a ghost of rhythm, a heartbeat of life that no longer keeps pace. Smoke from the hearth rises lazily into the rafters, mingling with the scent of burned rosemary and charred-wood, leaving a haze that softens the edges of the room. It is almost beautiful, this convergence of scent, shadow, and light. But beauty here is cruel, a reminder of life that continues despite despair. The widow pauses, pressing her forehead against her child's, inhaling the faint warmth of life that persists against the tide of sickness. Her hands, cracked and blistered, bear the history of toil, of cold, of a world that has demanded everything from her. Yet she continues, rocking, murmuring, whispering promises she cannot keep, for to stop would be surrender. Around her, others act similarly, tending, feeding, murmuring, praying. Each act of fragile rebellion, a small defiance against the inevitability that hangs heavy over the manor. A distant cough shatters the silence, brittle as dry twigs underfoot. Another answers it from across the village, and then another, until the night itself seems alive with suffering, a chorus of vulnerability. The blacksmith clenches his jaw, watching the horizon, imagining the lives once lived in those smoke-marked homes, tables once filled with bread and laughter, children racing through dirt paths now empty, all swallowed by absence. The rope sways again, a silent pendulum marking moments that have lost their meaning, a witness to the fragile endurance of life. The widow rocks her child more slowly, humming a tune that threads through memory and hope, each note trembling in the cold air. Her mind drifts to a world outside these walls, where fields yield harvest, where fire warms rather than trembles, where hands build instead of weight. She imagines hands pressed to bread, hammers singing on anvils, children laughing under a sun that rises and sets without fear. But the vision fades as the harsh scent of damp and decay reclaims the room, closing around her like a suffocating shroud. Even the blacksmith, stoic and silent, feels it, the heaviness of absence, the unbearable knowledge of those claimed and those yet to be. He moves to the hearth, warming his hands over a fire that flickers like a dying heartbeat. He imagines the weight of his ancestors, their strength and perseverance, and wonders if he can summon any fragment of it here. His mind drifts to the empty fields, the abandoned homes, the ropes swaying in the bell tower like a slow, relentless heartbeat counting down lives. The widow presses her lips to her son's hair, whispering a prayer she fears has no ear. She rocks him through the night, listening to the soft, uneven rhythm of his breathing. The manor is alive with small acts of defiance, whispered prayers, hands laid on fevered foreheads, the gentle tending of wounds no medicine can touch. Smoke rises from the hearth and from herbs burned in hope, curling toward the rafters like silent, fragile prayers. Each face carries a story of endurance. Each act of care a fragile candle flickering against the darkness. Night deepens. The wind scratches at the manor walls, lifting the edges of thatch and wood, breathing cold into the bones of those inside. The rope sways, its soft, eerie hiss a reminder that the hours are measured not by light or warmth, but by survival and loss. Candles gutter one last time, smoke tracing ghostly lines along the rafters. Beyond the walls, the world waits, indifferent. Fields empty, soil barren, homes silent or abandoned. Yet within this fragile sanctuary, life persists, tenuous and defiant, held by a mother's hands, a blacksmith's gaze, the faint rhythm of breaths and murmured prayers. And as the manor sleeps, or perhaps merely holds its breath, the night seems to pause, attentive and watchful. The widow's child shifts, the blacksmith tightens his hands, and somewhere in the distance, another cough breaks the silence. Shadows linger, smoke rises, and the rope in the tower sways, marking moments that matter and those that do not. It is a world fragile, hollow, and yet unbowed, where the smallest warmth can resist the cold, where whispered prayers may carry more weight than swords, and where the human heart endures even as the wind and the darkness bear witness to its limits. The river wound through the valley like a thick ribbon of sorrow, dark and sluggish, carrying the weight of seasons and the secrets of countless lives. Its waters shimmered dully, a black mirror to the sky, reflecting clouds so low and heavy they seemed ready to crush the land. Every ripple whispered of decay, mud, rotting reeds, the faint metallic scent of something long dead, carried along with the current, invisible yet undeniable. Along its banks, a lone fisher knelt on frost-hardened earth, hands shaking as he dipped the net into the river, each cast a fragile plea. When he drew it in, the fish that surfaced were mottled and strange, eyes cloudy with sickness, scales dull and lifeless, as if the river itself had already claimed them. He stared at the catch for a long moment, a hollow ache settling into his chest, the ache of survival without hope. The village beyond the river whispered in silence, its secrets crawling along narrow streets and through the fog that pressed against the cottages like a living thing. They said the sickness had eyes, that it chose who would live and who would die, and that it lingered longest where fear had taken root. Old women crossed themselves, fingers raw from repeated devotion, murmuring names into the damp night air, as if speaking them aloud could save those yet untouched. Mothers held their children close, faces pressed to the warmth of small bodies, and whispered prayers that were half fear, half command, hoping the words would bend fate. The men moved through the streets with heads down, shoulders hunched, gripping tools or buckets with trembling fingers, every footstep loud in the cold, quiet morning. Dogs padded behind them, low growls rumbling in throats, as though warning unseen forces that the village would not yield entirely. Torches flickered along the edges of cobblestone streets, their flames dancing in the heavy fog. Inside the cottages, herbs hung from rafters, dried leaves brittle and brown, suspended like charms against a darkness that could not be kept at bay. Garlic bulbs, threaded together and dangling over doorways, cast shadows that leapt across walls with every tremble of the flame. The scents of sage, yarrow, and nettle mingled with the river's decay, forming a pungent perfume of survival and desperation. In the corner of a small cottage, an elderly healer moved with quiet precision. Her hands were coated with the fine powder of ground herbs, grinding, kneading, forming poultices with motions that were both ritual and devotion. Her gaze was distant, reverent, almost fearful in its acknowledgement of the lives she could not save. Every breath she drew seemed to carry the weight of those already gone. Footsteps echoed across frost-lined streets, hollow and muted beneath the thick, heavy fog. A wheelbarrow creaked under the weight of the dead, a slow, inevitable rhythm that marked the passage of days. Every door slammed with deliberate force. Every shuttered window was a small, fragile barricade against what could not be held at bay. The villagers moved like ghosts themselves, silent shadows in the mist, their lives compressed into urgent, whispered routines of survival. In the square, a crow alighted upon the charred remains of a hearth outside a once bustling inn, its black feathers blending seamlessly with soot-stained stones. Its head tilted, beady eyes sharp and watchful, a silent witness to the human despair it did not understand. Evening descended slowly, reluctant to reveal the night. Lanterns glowed in the fog, halos of warmth swallowed by gray, cold mist. Shadows stretched and twitched along walls, warped by flickering light, seeming to watch, to judge, to remember. Every heartbeat was a drum, echoing in chests already burdened by fear. Every breath a gift that could be snatched away at any moment. The world itself contracted, pressing inward, compressing moments of life into heightened clarity. Pain, hunger, grief, courage, fleeting beauty, all raw and exposed. From the high hill that overlooked the river, the village was a patchwork of muted lights and darkened stones. Smoke curled from chimneys, thin and uncertain, carrying the scent of burning wood and the desperation of those who clung to warmth and hope. The river ran below like a wound in the earth, reflecting the gray of a sky heavy with the unspoken. Men and women moved through streets, heads bowed, shoulders heavy, carrying buckets of water, firewood, or the lifeless bodies of those who had succumbed before dawn. Their faces were pale, hollowed by fear and sorrow, eyes darting to shadows that could hide illness, death, or betrayal. Inside the healer's cottage, the old woman knelt beside a small hearth, grinding herbs into a fine, fragrant powder. Her hands shook, though her movements were deliberate, precise. She pressed a poultice to the fevered forehead of a young boy, whispering words that were prayers, commands, and pleas all at once. "Stay," she murmured, almost to herself, almost to the night. The boy's chest rose unevenly, each breath shallow and tremulous. She pressed the warm, bitter-smelling herb to his skin, feeling its weight like a fragile talisman against the relentless spread of sickness. Around her, the air was thick with incense, fear, and hope, mingling into a potent, tangible tension. She paused, inhaling it, letting the scent anchor her as she worked, knowing that even the smallest act of care was a rebellion against death. Outside, the village square was a tableau of grief and endurance. A mother knelt beside a tiny grave, tracing crude letters with frozen fingers, her lips moving in silent supplication. A dog lay beside her, its eyes half closed, ears flat, sharing in the quiet suffering that enveloped the living and the dead alike. Torches cast wavering light on frozen ground, highlighting the shadows of reeds by the river and the smoke of distant chimneys. The sick remained behind bolted doors, hidden from the world, while whispers of remedies, prayers, and old stories drifted from one trembling voice to another, a fragile network of human connection against the looming darkness. Night deepened, and the river ran slower, darker, as if burdened by all it had swallowed. Mist rolled in from the hills, curling like smoke, twisting around trees, stones, and abandoned carts, cloaking them in silence. From above, crows cried, their calls sharp and persistent, a reminder that life endured in strange, patient ways even as human existence faltered. Each step through the village, each flicker of lantern light, carried the weight of untold stories, of love, loss, fear, courage, and the tenuous tether between life and the dark. The healer finally rose, her hands worn and coated in powdered herbs. She pressed them to her chest, breathing slowly, listening. Beyond the window, the river flowed, indifferent and eternal, carrying whispers, memories, and illness in equal measure. She felt the weight of time press down like a heavy hand, and yet she remained a sentinel, a witness, a keeper of fragile lives. The soft cry of a child pierced the fog, and she closed her eyes, committing it to memory, a quiet act of defiance against the inevitability that pressed in. The village slept, or what could be called sleep in such times. Doors were locked, shutters closed, and every breath and heartbeat a fragile statement of existence. Lanterns dimmed, and crows settled upon rooftops, their eyes reflecting the soot-laden sky. The river moved steadily, carrying all that had been lost and all that might yet endure. The night itself seemed to pause, listening, mourning, holding its breath alongside the living. And when the first sliver of dawn brushed the horizon, pale and trembling, the village held its fragile breath. The river flowed on, slow and unrepentant, indifferent to grief and devotion alike. And still, the villagers endured, hidden, wary, haunted, but alive. Every heartbeat, every whispered prayer, every shadow pressed against the walls was a testament to their persistence. The world contracted in silence, then expanded again with each new breath, each new step, each new moment of quiet resistance. In the hush, in the fog, in the cold, they waited, clinging to the thin thread between despair and hope, knowing that the river would continue its patient journey, and with it, the endless cycle of life, death, and memory. Through narrow alleyways, the plague moves unseen, a shadow threading through the cobblestones slick with rain and frost, leaving whispers in its wake. Each footstep echoes hollowly, swallowed by the absence of life, as though the stones themselves mourn the passing of the living. The air hangs heavy with the scent of rotting bread, fermented wine, and the faint copper tang of dried blood, a grim perfume that clings to walls and wafts through every doorway. Doors sag on rusted hinges, their paint flaking like brittle leaves, a silent testament to neglect. In the town square, where once the cacophony of daily life surged, children shouting, blacksmiths hammering, merchants calling, the only sounds now are the moan of the wind and the occasional groan of a cart burdened with the immobile. Each echo is a reminder of the lives erased, the laughter stolen, the simple rhythm of existence silenced by an invisible terror. Women kneel beside tubs of soiled linen, their fingers cracked and bleeding from endless scrubbing in icy water, sweat mingling with tears that freeze on their cheeks. Their eyes are hollowed, sunken from sleepless nights, as they scrub fevered garments, seeking to erase not just the stains but the memory of bodies fevered and burning. A child's wooden toy, chipped and faded, lies abandoned beside a threshold, its painted face worn away by dust and neglect. Occasionally, a woman glances over her shoulder, as if expecting someone, anyone, to appear in the shadows, only to be met with silence so complete it presses on her chest. The wind carries the mournful toll of the monastery bells, vibrating through stone walls and hollow rooms, each clang a heartbeat marking not just time, but the thinning of life itself. And yet, despite the overwhelming despair, these women scrub, pray, and persist, a quiet rebellion against the inevitability of death. In the dim light of the scriptorium, a monk traces prayers along the edges of vellum, his ink pooling thick and dark, the color of fresh blood. He chronicles each death meticulously, each name a star catalogued in a sky blackened by grief. His hands tremble, not from age alone, but from the relentless confrontation with mortality, the intimate proximity to sorrow that scratches at his soul. The quill scratches against the parchment like fingernails across stone, each mark a lament. Outside the town gate, Carts creak under the weight of those who cannot walk, their bodies bent and fragile, groaning with fever. The driver's lips press against scarves, nostrils flaring, eyes darting at shadows that may conceal the invisible predator. The groaning of wagons and the shuffle of weakened limbs form a funeral march that the living cannot halt, a dirge carried by wind and echoing off empty walls. The town itself seems to inhale grief, exhale despair, as if every brick, every timber, every crooked roof had absorbed the anguish of the countless souls claimed by the plague. Children cling to worn wooden toys, their paint dulled by time and handling, their tiny hands tracing familiar shapes in dust. The scent of resin and candle smoke mingles with the sharper tang of fear, filling their lungs with the knowledge that life has become uncertain. They whisper prayers they have overheard or hum tunes that have lost their joy, their voices trembling, half for hope, half for comfort. Toys, once instruments of play, become talismans of endurance, relics imbued with the fragility of life. Even a table, a chair, a loaf of bread, mundane objects transformed into symbols of impermanence, witnesses to the relentless march of death. Each item holds memory and loss. Each shadow bears witness to absence. The plague is no mere illness. It is an architect of fear, a sculptor shaping the town into a monument of despair, leaving every inhabitant to navigate its corridors of silence. Outside the walls, the forest looms dark and indifferent, branches swaying in the icy wind like skeletal fingers. Wolves cry at the edges, their howls weaving into the town's sorrow like an oral tapestry of mourning. Travelers are rare and wary, faces hidden beneath hoods, their cloaks damp, their footsteps cautious. Smoke rises from chimneys in thin, hesitant plumes, signals of life but fragile and fleeting. Farms lie fallow, gardens overrun with frost-kissed weeds, and the soil cracked and barren under the indifferent frost. The rhythm of sowing and harvesting is absent, replaced by the slow, measured tick of survival against despair. The ordinary cadence of labor, of growth, of care, has been swallowed by silence. Only the wind persists, moving over empty fields, rattling broken fences, scattering seeds that will never grow, and carrying whispers of those who no longer exist. Inside the homes, candle flames flicker like fragile guardians, trembling against walls blackened by soot and neglect. A table, once the heart of family life, bears bowls of half-eaten bread, spoons left idle in the midst of absence. Chairs are tipped or empty, their presence a stark reminder that life can vanish in a single fevered night. Shadows creep along the floorboards, long, hungry, consuming the corners of rooms where rats scurry in search of warmth and scraps. The plague transforms the ordinary into the sacred. A wooden bowl, a torn blanket, a cracked window, all heavy with meaning, each object a testament to human vulnerability. Eating, breathing, even the act of sitting in quiet reflection has become ritual, a rebellion against the despair that licks at every threshold. Life clings stubbornly, though each moment is a fragile thread in a tapestry fraying under the relentless tide of death. The town's wells, once gathering places of laughter and gossip, are now approached with trembling hands, eyes darting, voices hushed. Water, that lifeblood, is drawn slowly, almost reverently, reflecting the gaunt faces of the weary. Dogs lie beside their masters, ears twitching, noses pressed to the floorboards, silent sentinels to a world grown strange. Even the earth mourns, heavy and unyielding, each stone and root imbued with sorrow, each shadow deepening the weight of absence. The sky, sagging with oppressive clouds, presses down upon rooftops and streets, a ceiling of grief that matches the heaviness in every chest. And still, People move through it, hesitant, careful, walking the labyrinth of loss with hearts pounding, hands shaking, voices soft but persistent, a quiet insistence that life, though battered, remains. Through narrow streets, the wind carries fragments of sound, a cough, a whisper of prayer, the scuff of a shoe on stone. In the corner of a ruined house, an old man hums a forgotten hymn, his voice frail but unwavering, clinging to memory and faith in a world that has forgotten both. Women barter in silence for bread, eyes avoiding each other, hands brushing in fleeting contact, the touch electric with shared fear. Children huddle under tattered blankets, their bodies shivering, eyes wide with stories they cannot yet name. Hearing the wind as if it were the voice of the vanished. Even a single candle, its flame trembling against the dark, becomes an anchor in the storm, a signal that the human spirit persists despite the shadow of annihilation pressing close. A candle flickers in a darkened window, its light fragile but resolute, trembling on the jagged edges of glass. Its glow falls across the street, illuminating the cracked stones, the leaning doors, the abandoned toys, a beacon of defiance in a night thick with despair. The wind carries whispers of prayers, the soft lamentations of those who have lost everything, and the occasional groan of a body surrendered to fever. Yet in that fragile flame, there is a thread of persistence, a reminder that life, however tenuous, endures. It exists in the monk's quill as it traces names on vellum, in a mother's hand scrubbing fevered clothes, in the child's faint laughter that escapes despite fear. Life endures because it must, because it knows no other choice, and because even in the deepest shadow, it seeks the light. The plague, invisible yet omnipresent, winds through alleys and doorways, threading through homes and hearts alike. Its presence is felt in every cracked stone, every shadow, every echo of absence. Yet life does not surrender entirely. It moves quietly, stubbornly, in small gestures of courage, in the preservation of memory, in the defiance of despair. The town, battered and grieving, holds itself together in fragile stitches of humanity, each soul a needle, threading hope through the fabric of desolation. And as night deepens, as shadows stretch like long, cold fingers, the town waits, suspended between despair and endurance, death and the faint spark of life. Somewhere, the monastery bells toll slowly, another hour marked, another life claimed, another story etched into the dark ledger of time. And in that sound, mingling with the sigh of wind through empty streets, lingers the unspoken question: who will survive to bear witness, and who will vanish into the silence, leaving only echoes and the scent of rotting bread behind? In the castle's kitchen, copper pots hung like silent sentinels over a hearth, their surfaces blackened and scarred from years of unrelenting flame. Smoke curled upward in thick, lazy spirals, catching the dim light of a single, flickering torch, and in the curling haze, the air seemed almost alive with the memories of every meal prepared, every hand burned, every whispered prayer of sustenance that had passed through these walls. The scent of boiling broth mingled with the metallic tang of iron knives, the bitter aroma of burned herbs, and the faint, underlying smell of damp stone, cold as the bones of those who had long since perished beyond these walls. Each inhalation carried with it a subtle ache, a reminder that even in warmth there was decay, and even in survival there was fear. Servants moved carefully through the shadows, their footsteps almost silent against the worn flagstones. They whispered to one another, not in camaraderie, but in necessity, as if sound itself might carry sickness. Their eyes darted constantly to the tapestries that lined the walls. Dragons and knights frozen mid-battle, banners flapping forever in frozen wind, warriors locked in the glory of triumphs long past. The scenes once inspired pride, now served only as grim reminders that history could not protect them from the present. Outside these fortified walls, the plague spared no one, noble or peasant, and within, the stone itself seemed heavy with its knowledge. The courtyard beyond shimmered faintly under a pale, frost-bitten sun. A knight sat alone upon a moss-covered stone bench, his leather gloves stiff and cracking in the early cold. His breath rose in thin, white ribbons, curling into the chill air before dispersing silently. He stared toward the closed gates, beyond which a world of sickness and death reigned, invisible yet palpable. Chickens pecked aimlessly at the frost-hardened earth, feathers ruffled against the cold, as if mimicking the tension that lay thick in the courtyard silence. Bells rang intermittently from the distant towers, their tones hollow and mournful, indistinguishable between summons, warning, or prayer. The knight did not move, nor did he respond. He simply watched, knowing that whatever life remained outside was slipping further into shadow, and that these walls, meant to shelter, now felt more like a cage. Inside, the kitchen hearth hissed and spat as embers leapt like living things, threatening to escape the confines of the blackened grate. A young boy, not yet 10 winters old, reached toward a boiling pot with trembling hands. Steam scalded his fingers, and a sharp cry tore from his lips, swallowed immediately by the thick stone walls and the murmuring of other servants. There was no time for tears. There never was. Every motion mattered. Water poured, bread kneaded, herbs minced, fire stoked, and each act, repeated again and again, became a fragile shield against the chaos beyond the gates. Survival was measured not in courage or strength, but in the repetition of these small, unrelenting tasks. The castle walls rose high and unyielding, arrow slits like dark eyes watching over the courtyard. The wind whispered through these narrow openings, carrying with it fragments of voices, distant and sorrowful. The mother calling for a child already claimed, the father cursing a sky indifferent to grief. The knight listened to these cries, each one cutting deeper than any sword could. His heart ached with every echo, every sob caught and carried across the frozen fields, settling in the marrow of his bones. He did not flinch, for to flinch would be to acknowledge helplessness, and helplessness was a luxury no one could afford. The kitchen was alive with sound, yet haunted by absence. Every utensil, every pot, every surface carried memory. The scrape of a knife across a chopping block, the faint clatter of a spoon dropped in haste, the hiss of boiling water. Each sound was amplified against the oppressive quiet. Shadows danced across walls in the flickering firelight, shaping themselves into grotesque parodies of knights and dragons, as though the room itself were haunted by the spirits of battles past. And perhaps it was, for in this castle, nothing was truly forgotten. Not the victories, not the defeats, not the lives that had been lost. The young boy stirred the pot with a wooden spoon, its handle worn smooth by years of use. His hands shook, not merely from cold, but from the weight of responsibility thrust upon someone far too young. He thought of his mother, her face a fading memory, her voice a distant echo, and wondered if she had succumbed to the same invisible enemy that now haunted these halls. A woman, older and steadier, leaned close and whispered, "Do not falter. They are counting on you. We all are." Her words were gentle, but they carried the weight of survival itself. He nodded, swallowing fear, and turned back to his task. In a world stripped of certainty, every measured action became a small defiance against the void. The knight rose from the bench, boots crunching softly against frost-crusted stones. He ran a gauntlet hand along the cold masonry of the walls, feeling the damp seep through leather and flesh alike. He closed his eyes and listened. The drip of water from a gutter, the faint scuttle of rats above in the rafters, the tolling of a distant bell. Every sound was a pulse of life, a reminder that the castle, though beleaguered, still breathed. And yet the weight of mortality pressed upon him, every heartbeat borrowed from a world that seemed increasingly intent on claiming it. Through the narrow slit of the gate, the knight glimpsed the land beyond. Fields lay barren under frost, livestock huddled or absent, and homes stood shuttered, silent as tombs. He imagined the roads clogged with the dying, carts drawn with bodies wrapped in cloth, the cries of those left behind silenced by grief and exhaustion. Somewhere, a child wept for a mother never to return. A father cursed the sky for cruel fate. The knight's chest tightened with the enormity of what lay beyond these walls, a world teetering on the brink of oblivion. He turned back, seeking solace within the castle's shadow, knowing that even these fortified stones could not withstand the encroaching despair indefinitely. Inside, the kitchen fire flickered and hissed, and shadows gathered in every corner, stretching and warping as if alive. The boy's small frame moved with careful determination, ladling water into pots, stirring scraps of vegetables into a thin, bitter broth. The older woman watched him, her face lined with exhaustion yet unbowed, a testament to the endurance of those who labor when hope itself feels distant. The castle was not merely a structure of stone. It was a crucible of human resilience, each life within a delicate flame against a cold, encroaching darkness. The knight's eyes fell upon the tapestries once more. Dragons and knights, swords aloft, forever caught in a frozen battle. He saw not glory, but futility, the relentless march of time and mortality, the certainty of decay. The very air seemed heavy with unspoken histories, the echo of laughter that once filled these halls, the memory of feasts long vanished, the silent screams of the sick carried away by the wind. Each sound, each shadow, each smell was a reminder that even in the strongest fortress, life remained precarious, fragile as frost upon stone. The young boy shivered, both from cold and from the unrelenting weight of survival. He glanced toward the hearth, where firelight reflected in copper pots, dancing across blackened walls, illuminating the faces of those around him. Each face was etched with the same weariness, the same tension. The servants, the cooks, the guards, all caught in the slow, suffocating grip of a world under siege by a disease invisible yet omnipotent. And yet, despite it all, they moved, breathed, persevered. They were not free from fear, but they were determined, as if defiance alone could stave off the inevitable. The knight finally stepped into the warmth of the hearth room, boots crunching softly, breath clouding in the cold air. His eyes met those of the servants, a fleeting exchange that needed no words. In that moment, understanding passed between them, a shared recognition that life, however tenuous, must be defended. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of decay, the cry of the lost, and the chill of frost that no fire could banish. But within the castle, for now, the hearth burned, copper gleamed, and life persisted, stubborn, defiant, fragile. The courtyard returned to silence, chickens having retreated to coops, leaving delicate, frozen footprints behind. Frost sparkled like fractured glass under a weak, gray sun, and the knight's eyes lingered on the stone bench one last time. The castle waited, patient and relentless, as all who dwelled within confronted the weight of the world turned cold and quiet. Outside, the wind whispered secrets through arrow slits, carrying voices of the lost, of those who vanished, of those forgotten. Inside, life continued, fragile and flickering like the last embers of a dying fire, hinting at the struggles that tomorrow would inevitably bring and the courage required to face them. And in that stillness, the knight whispered to himself, almost inaudibly, "We endure, We must endure. The words, carried on his breath into the frost-bitten air, became a silent prayer, a vow against despair. The castle, though cloaked in shadow and sorrow, responded in its own quiet way. The stones absorbed the sound, the fire cracked in acknowledgment, and the hearth flickered brighter, as if life itself were answering his vow. Outside, the wind continued to whisper, carrying tales of suffering, but inside, for a fleeting moment, hope survived, stubborn and unyielding, against the encroaching darkness. The monastery lies shrouded in morning fog, a fortress of stone and silence, suspended between the living and the dead. Each cloister, slick with frost, glints like glass in the dim light, and every step across the worn flagstones becomes a negotiation with the cold that seeps into bones and hearts alike. The air is heavy, sweet with incense that curls in pale tendrils through the corridors, thick and cloying, masking the persistent, subtle stench of decay that lingers from the infirmary. The smell of sickness is patient, invasive, wrapping around the novice's senses like a damp cloak. He walks with the tentative awareness of a man in a dream, each footstep a muted confession, each breath a fragile claim to existence. His heartbeat thunders in his chest, a primitive drum louder than the silence that presses against him from all sides. In the infirmary, the sick lie in rows, their bodies taut with fever, eyes glazed yet searching for a recognition that the world refuses to offer. The room smells of damp straw, unwashed linen, and the faint metallic tang of blood, reminders that life is fleeting, precarious, and often cruelly brief. The novice carries a bowl of gruel, its steam rising like a wisp of hope in the frozen room. His hands shake, the tremor betraying the fear he cannot speak, the fear of touching mortality so closely. One patient, a thin man with sunken cheeks and eyes too bright for his pallor, lifts his hand with a strength borrowed from desperation. The boy sets the bowl down, and the clink against the wooden tray sounds unnaturally loud, echoing off the stone walls as if to announce every small act to the ghosts that linger unseen. In that brief moment, silence and sound merge, and the world contracts to the space between his fear and the man's fragile endurance. Outside, the orchard stretches under the weight of frost, a silent witness to neglect, loss, and the quiet violence of winter. Each branch is a brittle limb, bowing under the memory of fruit long rotted, leaves shriveled to mere paper-thin relics of life. Birds have abandoned these trees, leaving only the hollow echo of their absence in the gray sky, a silence so complete that even the wind seems to hesitate. Frost cracks underfoot where a monk has walked in the pre-dawn, leaving footprints that will vanish in the first light. The orchard is more than emptiness. It is a mirror of the monastery itself, stripped bare by plague, hunger, and sorrow. Every frost-laden branch, every skeletal shadow, tells a story of endurance and grief, a landscape mapped in absence as much as presence. A bell tolls from the tower, low and resonant, vibrating through the walls and under the skin, marking hours, or perhaps marking the dwindling breaths of those who remain. Its voice is a deep, sonorous pulse, threading through corridors and chambers, threading through the scriptorium and infirmary alike. The monks respond with ritual movements. Hands fold, heads bow, lips murmur prayers in a language that feels both eternal and fragile. Yet for the novice, the sound is accusation. Each toll drags him closer to the inevitability that even the sacred cannot halt the relentless march of death. He wonders whether the bell counts the living or honors the dead, or perhaps it marks nothing at all, serving only as a reminder that time is a weight heavier than any stone. The scriptorium lies in semi-darkness, where manuscripts, their edges curling with age, lie open on desks polished smooth by centuries of hands. Ink smudges run across pages like rivers, marking prayers, lamentations, and accounts of the plague in the same breath. Quills scratch across parchment, each stroke a prayer, a record, a defiance against oblivion. One monk pauses to inhale the musty air, eyes tracing the faded words as if he could see through the ink into the souls of those who wrote them. The novice watches him, absorbing the reverence, the weight of centuries pressing against his own small frame. Here, faith and fear intertwine, forming a lattice as intricate as the script on the page. In these halls, survival is not only the preservation of the body, but of memory itself. Each smudge, each margin note, a testament that someone, somewhere once loved, once feared, once hoped. In the cloisters, frost glitters like fractured glass beneath the pale dawn. The novice walks slowly, mindful of every step, his breath fogging before him in small, tremulous clouds. He glances at the stone arches, each carved with figures whose eyes have long since worn away, leaving only the ghost of devotion. The wind whispers through the arches, carrying with it a chill that gnaws at the skin and the spirit alike. Somewhere beyond the walls, the orchard waits, silent and frozen, its bare branches trembling like thin fingers against the gray sky. Here, the world is pared to essentials: shadow, frost, and the relentless insistence of mortality. Within the infirmary, the sick groan in unison with the low creak of timbers and the faint clatter of trays. The novice moves among them, setting down bowls, adjusting blankets, murmuring words he barely understands but hopes will offer comfort. The room feels alive with an eerie intensity. Every cough, every shiver, every whispered prayer forms a tapestry of human vulnerability. Some of the patients clutch hands with one another, seeking warmth, seeking reassurance that even in the shadow of death, they are not entirely alone. The novice catches the eye of one child, hollow-cheeked, whose lips move soundlessly in prayer. Their gaze meets, and in that silent exchange, a fragile spark of human connection survives, fleeting but defiant. The bell tolls again, long and insistent, its reverberation threading through corridors, scriptorium, and infirmary alike. Time presses on, relentless and indifferent, and the novice feels its weight in the small, trembling bones of his hands. He wonders whether the tolls are a warning, a comfort, or merely the mechanical insistence of a world unconcerned with human suffering. Outside, the orchard waits, its frozen branches catching the dim light, silent witnesses to the lives lived and lost within these walls. Night falls slowly, a soft and absolute veil over stone, frost, and wood. Candle flames tremble against the chill, casting dancing shadows that twist and elongate across the walls. The monks gather for evening prayers, their voices a measured, haunting chant that rises and falls like waves against the cliffs of time. The novice joins, his own voice tentative, almost swallowed by the larger chorus. Yet he feels a connection to the centuries of devotion that precede him. In that sound, in that rising and falling of voices, the monastery is not merely a building. It is a crucible, a vessel of memory, endurance, and faith. The shadows of the sick and the lost seem to drift through the stone halls, merging with incense smoke and candlelight. And for a moment, the novice feels that life and death are not opposites, but threads of the same tapestry. In the orchard, the frost glistens beneath a pallid moon. Branches bow beneath their silent burdens, twisted silhouettes against the night sky. The air is sharp and quiet, and the only movement comes from the wind threading through the trees. Somewhere, a distant owl calls, a lonely cry that echoes the isolation of the monastery itself. The novice, lying on his straw pallet, listens to the faint sounds, the groan of timbers, the whisper of wind, the measured breathing of his fellow monks. In the hush, he senses the presence of those who have gone before him, their memory etched into every stone, every frozen branch, every curling page of parchment. Life is fragile, he understands, and yet stubbornly persistent, a light flickering against the encompassing shadow. By dawn, the fog will return, thick and suffocating, swallowing stone and orchard alike. The bell will toll again, each note a reminder, a lament, a call to endurance. The novice will rise, carrying within him the weight of what has been lost, and the fragile, enduring hope that still clings to these walls. Every corridor, every frost-laden path, every shadowed corner is a testament to survival, memory, and faith. Here, amidst sickness, frost, and silence, life persists, not triumphant, not assured, but defiant, luminous in its quiet, unyielding presence. And so the monastery breathes, a living relic of human striving, devotion, and loss. The stone walls remember every whispered prayer, every fevered groan, every trembling hand reaching for life. The orchard waits in frozen witness. The bell tolls in measured insistence, and the novice, trembling yet steadfast, carries forward the fragile flame of hope. In this monastery, every act is weighty with consequence. Every gesture is a communion with mortality, and every breath, every step, every heartbeat is a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. At dawn, frost clung stubbornly to every ridge and curve of the thatched roofs, each icy crystal catching the feeble light like tiny mirrors mocking the despair below. The village lay still beneath a pall of gray mist, as if the world itself hesitated to breathe. From chimneys, smoke rose in thin, wavering tendrils, carrying the scent of damp wood, peat, and the faint bitterness of burnt crust. It twisted lazily toward the sky, reluctant, fragile, like the lives it came from. Inside the cottages, families huddled close, their breaths visible in the cold, each exhalation a fleeting cloud of warmth that dissolved into the vast chill. Their whispers, subdued and urgent, barely pierced the weight of fear pressing down upon every chest, for each day in this village was a negotiation with an invisible enemy. The mill wheel groaned, turning with a reluctant, uneven rhythm. Its splintered beams creaked under the strain, each groan a mournful note in the morning's symphony of decay. Villagers paused at the edge of the square, listening for the sound, recognizing the slow heartbeat of life in a place otherwise suspended between survival and surrender. A baker, red-handed and frostbitten, lifted loaves from the oven, the scent of bread both comfort and cruel reminder of what they fought to preserve, sweet and bitter at once. The warmth of the crust whispered of nourishment, of continuity, of persistence, yet it also hinted at fragility. The bread would feed them, but could not protect them from the shadow that moved silently through their lives. Children watched from doorways, faces pale beneath threadbare cloaks, eyes wide as mothers and fathers attended the sick. Small hands clutched the worn fabric of garments, knuckles white, as they tried to comprehend the trembling figures before them. They were witnesses to a ritual of care, a quiet defiance against the relentless march of illness. A mother cupping a father's burning brow, a grandmother murmuring prayers as she spooned lukewarm broth into a fevered mouth, a neighbor rubbing ointments over swollen joints. Every act was infused with fear, yet also with devotion, a fragile ceremony performed in the shadow of mortality. In the graveyard, the earth resisted intrusion. Dark clods of soil, stubborn and heavy, lay upon frost-hardened ground, defying the hands that sought to lay bodies to rest. The iron gate hung crooked, swinging faintly in the wind, creaking like an ancient lament. Each mound seemed a protest, a whispered question. Why now? Why so many? A small bellbird landed on the edge of a roof, its song tentative and brief, swallowed immediately by the wind. In its melody, as fleeting as it was, lay the stubborn insistence of life, fragile against the enormity of death, a delicate heartbeat that dared to echo amid the frost and fear. Across the square, villagers' eyes met, and in their glances, a shared understanding passed silently. This plague was no mere illness. It was a shadow that crept into hearts, homes, and futures, shaping desires, stoking anxieties, and testing the limits of endurance. A mother's gaze lingered on her child, cheeks hollow, body trembling, and the weight of what may come pressed her into silence. A father's hand rested on a neighbor's shoulder, feeling the same tremor of fear, the same unspoken questions about what tomorrow might bring. The plague had become more than disease. It was a presence, a constant companion, and a mirror reflecting the deepest human frailties. The frost glinted on every beam and shutter, catching in the eyes of those who dared to look, sharp and unyielding. Yet beneath it lay warmth, stubborn and resistant. The mingling scents of bread, smoke, iron from the graves, and the bitter bite of the wind formed a tapestry of life in miniature. Messy, harsh, unflinching, yet persisting. A small dog padded across the cobblestones, its nails clicking faintly, ears pricked, tail low. It stopped at the edge of the graveyard, sniffing the cold soil, and then retreating, uncertain, vanishing back into the mist. Even the animals understood the weight of the shadow, moving cautiously, quietly, as if the world itself had grown dangerous and untrusting. Inside a modest cottage, a father traced the outline of a child's fevered hand with trembling fingers. The child whispered a question, almost too faint to hear, and the father responded with words laden with hope and despair. Across the room, the mother lit a candle, its flame dancing, casting long, twisting shadows across walls scarred by time and hardship. In the corner, a loaf of bread rested on a wooden board, warm and fragrant. Its presence was a quiet rebellion against hunger and frost, an assertion that life would continue, even if only for a moment, even if only in the small rituals of survival. Beyond the village, the wind spoke in hollow, whistling tones, rustling through bare branches and sweeping across skeletal fields. The frozen earth, unyielding and gray, concealed a slow, patient pulse of life beneath its surface, unseen but enduring. The villagers felt it too, an invisible hum threading through their days, a secret strength that demanded courage to notice. Every cautious step, every whispered prayer, every small act of care became part of a larger rhythm, an insistence that, even under siege by fear and disease, the human spirit endured. The morning stretched, pale sun struggling against the frost, casting elongated shadows across the square. Children clung to parents, faces turned to the feeble light, and for a moment the village seemed untouched, almost whole. But the shadow lingered, in coughs stifled behind cupped hands, in shivers that rattled despite layers of wool and fire, in the silence that fell after the bellbird's brief song. Life persisted, but tenuously, a fragile line drawn between despair and endurance. A priest emerged at the edge of the square, carrying a small crucifix and ashes, robe flapping in the wind. His movement spoke louder than words, crossing thresholds, bowing, sprinkling ash, a ritual offering for souls unseen. Villagers watched, some with hope, some with suspicion. Faith, they understood, was both weapon and shield. It wove through their lives as invisibly as the frost, steady yet vulnerable, a thread binding them to each other and to the world they had known before shadow had claimed it. The mill wheel groaned again, uneven and laborious, each turn a heartbeat marking time in a village suspended between life and death. Smoke rose steadily from chimneys, and the bellbird's song dared again, fragile but persistent. Somewhere in this fragile interplay of frost, fire, and wind, life continued, quiet, stubborn, intimate. By mid-morning, the village fell into its reluctant rhythm. Mothers tended the sick, children observed and learned, fathers labored where strength remained. The frost glittered, persistent, unmoving, reflecting the cold that had settled into their hearts. Yet in every act of care, every fleeting warmth, every note of the bellbird's song, there was resistance. There was refusal. Life, despite all, clung stubbornly to the day. A blacksmith's hammer struck slowly, metal ringing against stone and iron. Sparks flew, tiny flares swallowed immediately by the gray light. He worked in silence, muscles taut, sweat frozen along his temples. The sound was a pulse, measured, deliberate, a rhythm of defiance against the creeping stillness of the plague. Across the square, villagers paused to listen, each strike a reminder that survival was not passive, that endurance required labor, courage, and patience. Even the wind seemed to recognize the fragile persistence of the village. It whispered through the gaps in shutters, around corners, and over frost-hardened paths, carrying with it scents of smoke, soil, and faint, lingering bread. The smell mingled with fear, hope, and the muted cries of those too weak to rise. Yet there was resilience woven into the air, unspoken and untouchable, waiting to manifest in acts as small as a hand offered in comfort, a loaf of bread shared, or a fleeting song caught on the wind. As the day progressed, the villagers moved like shadows themselves, careful, deliberate. Eyes met in fleeting glances of understanding. I see your struggle. I endure alongside you. The bellbird perched once more on a frost-lined roof, singing hesitantly, its fragile voice cutting through the cold and quiet. Children stopped to listen, breaths held, feeling the impossible weight of hope in that small song. It was proof, delicate yet undeniable, that even in the harshest dawn, life could persist. The sun shifted, shadows lengthened across the crooked gate of the graveyard, touching freshly turned mounds of soil. A quiet question lingered, heavy and unspoken. How long can life endure when death is so immediate, so omnipresent? Each villager carried their answer silently, measured in every step, every whispered prayer, every act of care. Yet in the frost, in the smoke, in the smell of bread and iron, and in the song of solitary bird, the village persisted. And in that persistence lay a quiet rebellion. Frost glinted, smoke curled, bread warmed, and the bellbird sang again, fleeting but insistent. The heartbeat of life, though tentative, remained. Shadows lingered, fear endured, yet in every small act, the villagers carved out space for hope. Dawn broke fully, pale, trembling, fragile, but real. In the frozen village, life and death coexisted, each breath a negotiation, each gesture a defiance, each glance a pledge. We endure.